I'm extremely pleased to be here at a conference in Howard's honor. Howard is the most inspiring person I've ever worked with, and probably likely ever to work with. So it's been such an honor to work with him and be part of setting up 3IE and seeing what it has become. I still often refer to 3IE as my baby. And in fact, I know that there's a lot of amazing staff of 3IE also around, and I think everyone actually also feels the same way, that this is part of their baby. So and that's, I think, also a tribute to Howard, that the way he's been leading the organization, we also feel very much that this is our baby, and even if we leave, we sort of, a piece, certainly for me, a piece of me stayed behind in 3IE. The other thing about influence that is quite interesting is, you know, in evaluation we often deal with trying to see how we influence policy, etc. And one of the many very imperfect ways that this is done is through citations and references and so on. And just to say, you know, the paper I'm now going to be presenting to you, it's called Who Cares About Development Outcomes? It's with my co-author Ulrich Bartsch, also at the World Bank. If you were just going to look at citations in there and references from Howard White, you wouldn't find maybe that many. But in fact, you know, a lot of the thoughts that have gone into it have been influenced by, you know, the interaction on a daily basis with Howard. There might have been things we have agreed on. It might have been things that he'd said that has triggered something in me. So influence is so much more than just, you know, citations and paper. I think that is important to keep in mind. The other note that I should make is the usual disclaimer. What I'm going to present to you today, and you will realize why, does not represent neither a World Bank view nor an independent evaluation group point of view. It is based on my experience through these different organizations. Now, this issue of stretching that Howard mentioned. So I'm going to try to get you to stretch, but in a special way. I want you know, how many in this room are actually involved in research or evaluation of development issues? Please just raise your hands. Okay, that's pretty much many more than 50%. And how many of you are involved in development policy making? Or I think you might be, you know. So yeah, a few, okay. And finally, how many of you care about development outcomes? Okay, I didn't see anybody who didn't raise their hand, because then I was going to ask, you know, is it the development part you don't like, or is it the outcomes part? But I'm not gonna ask. So what I'm about to argue is that the way the development business is done today, those of you who raised your hands about the issue of caring about development outcomes and doing work that you think is influencing it, well, you're likely to be wasting your time. So I was planning maybe just to leave at that, you know, and this was the following the Google example that Howard gave us yesterday. This was the picture I found when you sort of look for pictures of farewell. So I got that one. But that, of course, would not be very nice to all of you, to keep you and after this nice day, you know, close on this kind of somber note. So what I will be doing is actually present to you and hopefully, you know, trigger some reactions, maybe antibodies, but some little bit controversial solutions to make development outcomes really part of what we do. So I'm going to bring basically some hope to this presentation. I will make the following arguments today. So first, I will argue that the development business, because yes, it is a business, we're basically demanding and supplying development assistance, that this development business and the marketplace is beset by what I call market imperfections. And that these market imperfections, they not only make it difficult to achieve the right outcomes, but they also take away incentives to learn around what works. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I will then suggest that this insight needs us or leads us to have to rethink responsibilities and accountabilities in the development business in order to first ensure that development outcomes are traded in the development marketplace, and then second, that development agencies are made financially accountable for development outcomes. And finally, the third point is that I will describe the role of the evaluation function in aligning incentives and with the ultimate goal of improving lives. Okay, so I was going to to tell the long story about how the development business emerged, you know, from the sunset days of the British Empire, etc. But I realize it's late in the day, so I'm just going to say that, you know, how after the Second World War, the colonial administrators and missionaries gave way to what we'd call the independent governments and the army of bankers and social scientists that took over. So this is about 70 years ago. Now, you know, all is not well with the development business 70 years hence. There's a lot of money and a lot of brain power that has gone in and still goes into expended on inputs, you know, brick and mortar investments, changing regulations and policies, etc. But all too often the outcomes fall far short of expectations. So you have tracks that are being built that have displaced 400,000 people in Cambodia and have sunk these families into further poverty. You have schools that have been built in Afghanistan that see no female students and perhaps, I'm not sure, maybe no teachers. I didn't find a picture of the third example I wanted to give, but I remember when I worked on Haiti, one of the famous projects there was a road that was being built, and they had to stop the project because of basically beneficiary, what do you call it? No, they were protests, beneficiary protests, exactly, and it stuck in my mind. So what is that, beneficiary protest? Huh?
It's the road between Lakai and Jeremy.
Exactly. But it sort of tells you something. Well, are they really beneficiaries? Is if they start, you know, try to stop the project. So there are a lot of these examples. Now, you know, that's okay. I mean, you know, the development business is a risky business, and if you use all the knowledge you have, and you still fail, that might be good, or you know, that might be understandable. But these were examples where there are very known things like having consultations. Finding out who will be displaced. You know, in the case of schools in Afghanistan, you know, this basic cultural knowledge that girls will not, you know, need to have a separate room. They will not be allowed to be in a room together with boys. These were, you know, basically projects where the mistakes could have been avoided. But still, the much bigger problem is, you know, not so much the things that failed, and we know failed, but it's all the lack of evidence we have on many fronts. And in one of the seminal reports, and I'm glad to see that my co-panelist is Ruth Levine here today. She was part of the CGD and part of writing this very influential report called "When Will We Ever Learn?" And they basically concluded that after decades in which development agencies have dispersed billions of dollars for social programs, and development countries, country governments and non-governmental organizations have spent hundreds of billions more, it is deeply disappointing to recognize that we know relatively little about the net impact of most of these social programs. Now, this was in 2006. As has been mentioned, I believe also earlier, this was also one of the main reasons why 3IE was created in order to address this issue. Now, talking about influence, you know, when I joined NORAD at the evaluation department, before I took that decision, I asked Howard at the time, I've been offered this really interesting job, should I take it? And he said yes. And I thought, you know, I've realized, or come to realize later, that is actually I'm part of an experiment. I don't know if it's a randomized trial. I don't know if there's somebody else around that's doing something else. But he thought that this was interesting to sort of see, you know, somebody that he'd been partly, you know, helped to form in 3IE now goes on, you know, let loose on this bilateral agency, and let's see what happens. Will she be able to bring in, you know, some of these thoughts into a sort of not the most advanced bilateral agency around? And one of the things I started after having seen, you know, the situation at NORAD, I decided to do an evaluation of the availability of Norwegian aid, because I was seeing that this was potentially a program, but I realized people wouldn't take my word for it. And the report came out this year, so after I left, and it came out finding basically that there was very little clarity about minimum standards that needed to be put in place in projects in order to be able to evaluate them, and then later on. It was very low priority by senior management, and in general lack of incentives to prioritize results. So now we're getting at some of the issues why maybe even though we have all the tools, we know how to evaluate, it's still not done enough. Now having been let loose for a while in NORAD, I then moved on to the bank, to the World Bank, to the independent evaluation group. And was fortunate enough there to be able to work on a rather similar, as a manager, rather similar evaluation, where we're looking at whether and how the bank learns within its operations. And one of the things, by the way, the way the bank, one of the ways the bank evaluates is that each project, each operation, when it closes, it has an implementation completion results report done to it. It's done to it on the operational side, and then at IEG we validate that, that evaluation. So each and every one of them has an own evaluation and an independent validation of the same, 100%. And what we found in this IEG evaluation, the large one that looked at how the bank learns, that only 17% of recently evaluated World Bank operations cited impact evaluations in the project completion report, only 17%. But that's not the biggest thing. I mean, the impact evaluations are still growing, and who knows what exactly would be the correct number to have. But a much larger majority were basically, where they were doing what we call outcome monitoring. They might say, how the outcome looked at the end of the project, how it looked at the beginning. Very, very few were discussing other factors that might have influenced this outcome. So, let alone forget about impact evaluation, but let's, just thinking about what else could have influenced this. The other revealing finding was that only 23% of a sample of recently closed projects had established good M&E systems. And this is, this is basic, right? This is how you're going to know whether your project is performing well, etc. So. Quite worrying. So I went on then to wonder. If we don't do these things, you get the evaluations and you get the organization that you want to have. So clearly there was something wrong with the incentives, and I was wondering then who cares about development outcomes? Because clearly there's not enough done to be able to evaluate and know what works in these projects. And one thing, all the development agencies, they usually have the stated objective to improve the welfare of populations in developing countries as measured by certain development outcomes. But there is this huge thing. There's all these additional objectives, usually not talked about. One that I found very prominent in Norway is the one that I call doing good, or the warm glow. very prominent. So, and in fact, I gave a similar talk recently in Norway, and I remember one of the participants said, "Oh, you got me really depressed now because you know I felt good about before I had heard your presentation about my tax money being spent on these things, but now you made me all insecure, you know." So that's one area, and then of course promoting national interests. A lot of the bilaterals actually have the development part, and the foreign affairs often together, and very often the development is actually an aid is used for foreign policy purposes rather than necessarily aid in itself. So this is also an issue. And then in places like the bank, I mean, the bank is also business, it's a development business with all sorts of issues that could be related to that. So the problem is that the actual interactions between the development agency and the counterparts in the developing country, they relate to negotiations around the inputs and outputs. So, we might all state that we want good outcomes, but the contracts and everything is around inputs. It's about activities, schools built, teachers trained, etc. And I'll come back to say more about that. So what I would like, this is why I really like the shopping cart. I wanted it in there. So, and had it been a TED talk, I actually would have had one and sort of, education, yeah, put it in there. But, so the shoppers in the development marketplace, they care more about being seen shopping, perhaps, than actually about what ends up in the shopping cart. That's my suggestion. This issue of lack of attention to M&E and outcomes, I want to point out that this should not be taken to indicate a lack of commitment on the part of staff of development agencies to pursue the stated objectives. Most of them are, us, I mean, I've been in operations for many years, are deeply, deeply committed to improving lives in developing countries. So that's not it. So therefore, another explanation needs to be found to why we know so little about goods sold and bought in this development marketplace. And the paper suggests that the salient features of the development business itself make it susceptible to market imperfections. And so let's talk about that. So what are market imperfections? Those are situations in which the allocation of goods and services by a free market are not efficient, implying that a better overall allocation could exist. And there are three particular issues I would like to address here. The first is the issue of externality. So what I mentioned already earlier, the outcome good, which is the ultimate purpose of the engagement, is not part of the market transaction. And in a sense, then, if it ensues, it can be treated as a positive externality. So there's no negotiation around the negotiation, is around inputs and outputs, schools built, teacher trained, etc., and not outcomes such as improving literacy or decreasing the repetition rate. And the other part that makes this very, like an externality is that the parties involved in this negotiation, this contract, are often not directly benefiting from the provision of the outcome good, which is, at the end supposed to benefit the poor. And while for some of you the term externality, you would think about this as that's something that's related to unintended effects. What I'm, arguing here is that the development business actually treats ostensibly intended outcomes as unintended, because they often remain outside the transaction and they remain unmeasured, and because achieving these outcomes has no or little implication for the parties involved in the transaction. So whether the outcomes achieved or not, for example, the country will repay its loan to the bank, as an example. Sorry, that's one. So the second market failure that I'd like to talk about is what is known as the principal agent problem, which is, imminent and widely dispersed in this area. So this is, the interests and incentives and actions of the development agency and the recipient country are not perfectly known and observable to the other party. And the issue with principal agent, it becomes a problem when one entity, which is the agency, is able to make decisions that impact another entity, which is the principal, but he is motivated to act in ways that do not fully represent the best interest of the principal. So there are many layers of this principal agent problem you can find in development agencies. So once, on the one hand, you have in the country, you'd say that, for example, the recipient country may or may not act in the best interest of the poor. On the other hand, in the development agency, you have this kind of possible principal agent relationships between, for example, in the bank, between the board to its management, between the management to the staff, etc. Now, the last point of market imperfection is what is around uncertainty. The extent to which inputs and outputs will deliver the outcome good, this is marred in uncertainty. Because the theory of change, or also what I would call the production function, is the production function where inputs and outputs lead to outcomes. This is uncertain, and evidence on effectiveness of particular interventions is still, even though 3I has existed for a while, pretty scarce. The other part of the uncertainty is that it takes the outcomes actually take years to appear, many years down the line from a project is started, and they only appear if you actually measure them. They won't appear by themselves. Okay. So let me propose a little model here of what a prevalent principal agent contract looks like. So here you have a development agency, and it has two things. It has a carrot and stick, right? And the carrot is the loan, or potentially just the aid, and the conditions are typically around around what it needs to be used on. So equipment, buildings, training events. There might be some policies that are conditioned, so such as safeguards, procurement, etc. Or the conditions could be around the implementation and approval of policies. These are called policy loans. So you have the carrot and the stick, and then this goes to the developing country or the recipient country, and then they repay their debt later on, right? So debt service. And as you see the little cloud there, that's where the outcomes are. They are no part in this contract. So this is my suggested current model. Oh, 5 minutes? No, 10. I have a half an hour. I started it. I need 10 minutes. Okay.
Guess there'll be no questions, guys.
So let me propose the alternative then. Proposed principal agent contract in development. So what we propose is first making sure that development outcomes form an integral part of the contract in the development business. And then second, make development agencies financially accountable for these outcomes. So in other words, we propose turning the usual donor-recipient relationship on its head. The country would contract the development agency to produce development outcomes. So this is what you see. You have a recipient country, it contracts a development agency. If the development agency produces the outcomes, then it gets the carrot. It gets, first of all, it gets actually the warm glow of having achieved outcomes. It gets repayment. And finally, it probably will get the next contract because the first one it was doing was actually working. However, if outcomes are not produced, there's no warm glow, there's no new contract, possibly, and finally, what I'm suggesting is maybe there should be a reduced payment. The agency was obviously not proposing and able to provide a solution. Now, how would this look for bilateral aid agencies that don't have loans? Well, you could actually do something similar. I know there's a colleague from NORAD, from Norway here, and I'm interested to hear whether he believes this would work. But Norway is very proud of its 1% of GDP to ODA, to assistance, right? So if I said that, look, if your aid didn't aid, why should you discount it from the 1%? You know, it might actually be an interesting threat. Okay, let me say I've covered the two first pieces of this the 4 pieces to this new proposal. The first one is to develop the development outcomes form an integral part of the contract in development business. This is not entirely new. This has been done, and there's a number of initiatives, cash on delivery, payment for results, etc., that do this. And CGD has been one of the organizations, promoting and talking about this. But those programs have not changed the agency model. So they remain. So the principle remains the developing agency, and which basically pays the developing country upon verification of results. So the second part is suggested is that to rethink the traditional model where the development agency is the principal. The third piece that I'm saying is just by having development outcomes in the model doesn't make it market-based. For a market, there needs to be competition. Okay, so the third piece is actually to let the development country say, here's, I want improved maternal health, etc., in my country. Put it out for bid. Let the different development agencies bid and show their portfolios of successes, and go for the one which is most cost effective. So that's the third part of the proposal. And the fourth piece is, of course, risk sharing. So currently, as I said, all the risk is carried by the developing country in a sense that, a program might not work. It might even only produce unintended negative effects. However, the country needs to repay in full. Well, let's rethink the risk sharing and put more of the weight of the risk also on the development agency. And what that would do is actually incentivize an interest in developing good evaluation and monitoring systems and investing that in the countries and supporting it through the projects. There are just 2 slides more, but they will be very short. Just to say that the evaluation function is obviously crucial here. I mean, if you can't do anything and condition payment on results if you don't have results measured. So it's pretty obvious. And so one thing that the evaluation function can do is to help strengthen the M&E capacity, both in its own organization as in the countries. The independent evaluation function, which is sort of outside of the operational side, could be the arbitrator of the M&E system and the validity of what it produces. You need an independent, entity to do that. And finally, the evaluation function could provide evidence of how much obtaining certain development outcomes could cost. So this is obviously crucial. Without it, you can't go with this model. I'm just going to say that, I'm not going to talk through it, but I'm just going to say that there's also a role in the evaluation function for incentivizing outcomes that are conducive to, behaviors that are conducive to outcomes. And this is by the way we are rating people, etc. The projects are being rated, and if you could tie that more closely to sort of incentives, etc., for staff, for managers. But I'll just put it out there so you ask me a question about it. I won't talk through it in detail. Finally, final thoughts. Well, the question is really, can we place development outcomes into the shelves of the development shopping mall? And I'd like to, and I'd like you to join me in this. And ultimately, this will depend on whether I was going to say the agencies involved in trading development, or the shoppers, but I'd say also we, I mean we all, if we care more about, you know, being seen shopping, or whether we actually care about development outcomes. So I'll stop there. Thank you.